So, I have a very personal story about my ex-boyfriend from way back when I was a 16-year-old girl. Back then, as most kids do, I thought I was invincible, and like no one could tell me what to do or run my life. I had it in my head that anyone that tried to give me advice or told me that I should do anything was trying to control me, and I was unwilling to listen to them. Basically, I was your stereotypical teenage girl that was in love with the first guy that had paid any attention to her. The problem was that he, in and of himself, was a problem. He was 20 and had a car and was into a few substances. I never dove down that rabbit hole with him, but I was there when he would use, so I saw what it did to him, how he would get, and so on. I'm pretty sure it goes without saying that my parents did not like me being with a 20-year-old guy that was a user and was probably on a list down at the local police station of people to watch. That, plus the fact that, again, I was 16 at the time this all took place. Yeah, they really didn't like me being with him. Unfortunately, my parents were pushovers. They never found that balance of being assertive and being relaxed. They would tell me that I wasn't allowed to see him, and I would just roll my eyes and laugh. Then, I would say I was going over to my friend Lisa's house, and would just meet him at the corner of the street. They knew, they just never stopped me, which is ultimately what caused this whole thing to play out. For my ex, we're going to go with the name Jason. Obviously, that's not his name, but it works. Jason was one of those guys that literally gave zero cares, and that's probably where I developed that mentality. If it helps to explain the dynamic between he and I, we met at school. Now, I know what you may be thinking. You were 16, he was 20, so it could have been you were a freshman and he was a senior type of situation if the two of you were together for 2 years prior to the event. But nope. That would actually almost have been a better situation than what it was. Jason was actually hired as a janitor at my school during my sophomore year. So, when we met, he was an adult in authority at my school, and I was a clueless 16-year-old girl. And as all wonderful romances go, we actually first spoke during lunchtime when I went to throw my trash away, and he was cleaning up a mess on the floor by the garbage cans. Looking back, the fact that he talked to me and hit on me back when I was a student raises a lot of red flags. But at the time, I was just happy to be getting positive attention. Because as non-controlling as my parents were, they were also just simply not present in most of my life. So now that you know who Jason is, and the fact that he was obviously a predator, I think it's best to get into the events that took place. At this point, we had been together for a few months, probably close to 4 or 5, and the school year was getting close to being over. At this point, I hadn't had a whole lot of time to spend with Jason, as I'd been cramming for my finals, because deep down, I was still that nerdy girl that wanted to get good grades, and despite the fact that my grades had been kind of slipping, I was not going to fail my 10th grade year. Because I was studying, I wasn't seeing Jason as much as he had liked, which he made obvious every time he saw me in school. He would pull me away into an empty section of the hallway to make out with me and grope me. By this point, we hadn't consummated our relationship completely, And he'd been pretty good about keeping his hands off of me while we were in the school building. But around this time, he started to not seem to care as much. It was like the less he saw me, the more hands-on he would get when he did see me. Unfortunately for him, this was the early 90s, and our school did have cameras. And I think you can see where this is kind of going. He ended up getting fired, and the school threatened that they were going to have to give the footage to the police as I was a minor. Now, you may think that this is where the story ends, but no, it's not. And this was more the cause of what actually happened. On the day that Jason got fired, he drove back up to the school near the end of the day and waited for me out front. As I walked out to get on the bus, he shouted out to me and waved for me to come over. I was a bit confused as he usually got off the shift after I got home, but it was a nice surprise, so I hopped into his van and we drove away. Now, at first, I thought we were just going to do the normal things that we did when we were together, but something seemed a bit different this time around. He looked agitated and almost scared. I tried to ask him about what was wrong, and he shushed me, which was really strange to me. I let it go for a little while, but I then quickly realized that we weren't heading in the direction of anything that I knew, so I asked him again what was going on. He pulled over into the parking lot of a store and just kind of sat there for a moment, staring out into the empty space. I wasn't sure what to do, so I sat there in silence for a little while with him, and just accepted that something was going on, and that he would tell me what it was eventually. After a bit of this, he asked me if I loved him, which was a strange thing to ask, especially sitting in a Kmart parking lot. Now, at this point, there hadn't been an exchange of I love yous between us. I was still shy about things, and while there had been some intimacy that happened, it never went all the way, and we never talked about love. However, I was a child, with a child brain, and that's the honest truth. He was in a position of power over me because he was an adult, and he had the authority. And I thought that what we had was, in fact, love. Being the dumb little girl that I was, I told him that I did love him. He then asked if I wanted to be with him, and again, I told him that I wanted to be with him more than anything else. He nodded, while it looked like he was starting to cry. He then told me that he had been fired from the school because they saw us kissing on the cameras. I thought that this was the whole problem, that he'd been fired and that it was my fault. I know now it wasn't my fault, but back then I blamed myself. So I thought that he was going to break up with me or something, and I told him I was so sorry that it happened, and then mentioned that it was because of me and that I would try to tell the school that I should be the one punished and not him. He then says that he didn't care about the job. He cared about losing me, and that not being at the school meant that he would never see me again. He threw in a few flattering adjectives there to, I guess, really lighten the mood, and then looked me straight in the eyes and told me that he loved me and wanted to be with me forever. At this point, I was bawling and telling him that I was sorry, that I wanted to be with him too, which he took as the go-ahead for his plan. His plan was to drive off into the sunset with me in the passenger seat and, I guess, live with me forever in his minivan. I really don't know what he was thinking long term, or if he was at all at that moment, but he looked at me and said, "They're not going to take you away from me. You're mine." I kind of just nodded and said okay, unsure of what exactly that meant, but he put the car in drive and took off from the parking lot toward the highway. Now, at first, The adrenaline and excitement of running away from the city that I had always known, and from my life, was great. I was excited to get out onto the road and be free from whatever burdens there were of being a suburban 16-year-old girl, whatever that means. We drove until around 1 or 1:30 in the morning, just going straight out until he felt like he couldn't drive anymore. I didn't have my license, so our only option was to pull off somewhere and sleep. My thought was, of course, a hotel or a motel. His plan was for us to sleep in the cluttered area in the back of the van. So, we crawled back there and I told him goodnight, which was not part of his plan. I'm not going to get into the entire detail of everything that happened here, because I don't want to relive a lot of it, and some readers may have dealt with similar trauma. I'm just going to say that he wanted it, I told him no and that I wasn't personally ready for it, and then it happened anyway. This was the first point where he was ever physically violent or aggressive with me. Prior to this, minus the groping and the few other sexual things that had happened between us, he had never been aggressive. This was to the point that he hurt me. And that's where I'm going to leave that. The next morning was obviously awkward. I felt like he had violated my trust and violated me, but I also felt like maybe that was a normal feeling. Mostly because I had no idea what normal was in this circumstance. It was weird, because he wouldn't look at me when we woke up, and he barely even spoke to me when we got on the road. It was like he knew what had happened was wrong, but instead of facing it, he had to shut me out. We got back on the highway and started to head west, which I guess was his plan. But while we drove, he just kept staring forward and not speaking, not looking at me, not even acknowledging me. Every time I would say something, he would give a short answer or just ignore me. Again, I felt like I had done something wrong here. Like I had done something to make him mad, and I was so very confused about the whole situation. Then I said something that I guess I shouldn't have. I asked him when we were going to go back home. I don't know why I asked this. I don't know what made me think we would ever be going back home, like this wasn't seriously a kidnapping, but I just straight up asked him, when are we going to go back? As soon as I asked this, he launched into a tirade about how much of an ungrateful bitch I was. How I obviously didn't love him, and how he was disgusted with the fact that he had given himself to me, only for me to be so ungrateful. This went on for quite a while. I just started crying and staring out at the road while he screamed at me and berated me. I think it was at this point that I realized I may have made a mistake. Better late than never, right? We drove for a while longer, until he pulled off the highway and parked at a gas pump, and then said that he needed to fill the tank up. He handed me a $20 bill and told me to go pay the man inside. At this point, I think I was a literal mess. Having not showered, slept in a hot van all night, been on the road for almost 24 hours and sobbing endlessly, but I told him okay. And I walked into the gas station to give the clerk the money. As soon as I got in, and I went to hand him the cash, I glanced over to get the pump number, and I watched as Jason started the van and drove off. I just stood there and watched this man that had taken me from my home and taken what was left of my innocence, abandon me in an off-the-highway gas station. I had no idea where I was. I had no money other than the $20. And this was the early 90s, so I didn't have a cell phone. All I had was my small shoulder bag, and I carried it more for aesthetic than utility. standing there, watching him drive away, and then looking at the clerk who was just staring at me confused, I think that was the most surreal moment of my life. I just kind of blinked and opened my mouth to talk, and then puked what little I'd eaten for the past day on the floor of his store. He told his coworker to call 911 for me, and ran over to stop me from falling onto the ground and just kept telling me that I was going to be okay. The ambulance showed up, as well as the police, and they took me to a nearby hospital for checkup. Around this time was actually when I learned where I was. He had abandoned me at a gas station about an hour away from Colorado Springs. And to tell you how far that was, we lived close to central Illinois. He had driven me across our home state, through part of Missouri, most of Kansas, and then into Colorado, and just left me there after violating me. After I got to the hospital and was given fluids and food to get me stable, the police started asking questions. And that's when I let the floodgates open. I told them everything. I told them about Jason, who he was, what we were. I told them about what he had done the night before, everything up to the point that he left me at the gas station. I dug my home phone number out of my purse and asked them to please call my parents. They took it, and they told me to try to relax while they took the situation from there. And let me tell you, I absolutely did. I think I passed out as soon as they left the room. The next thing I remember was being woken up and told that my parents had been contacted and that they were on their way to come and get me. Obviously, I had a lot of explaining to do to my parents about everything. I told them about what had happened, and I apologized nonstop for putting them through this. I know I probably scared them to death when I didn't come home that night, and I can imagine they were terrified when they got a call from a Colorado police department saying they were calling about their daughter. The police did eventually catch Jason. He was heading to California, and after they learned about it, they put out a call to look for his car. They pulled him over, and they arrested him from there. Thankfully, me being a minor, and the cameras at the station catching him pulling up and me getting out of the car, alongside the footage of what had happened at the school, was enough to put him away for a very long time, on a number of charges. Those charges include kidnapping, of course. I had to testify against him, and explain how he had manipulated me, but after that, I never saw him again. Now, I won't say it was easy getting past this whole thing. Thankfully, I wasn't pregnant after that night, which was a real fear of mine. I did have to go to a therapist for a while to really work through it, though, and eventually, I was able to say that it was not my fault, that he had coerced me, and that I was a child being led by an adult in this situation. This was around 30 years ago at this point, and while it still does bring back those uncomfortable feelings, it's more important for me to look forward and remember that I am a stronger person now. I have a life that I'm happy with, and he'll be rotting in prison until he's at least in his 60s.